This is Victoria Price. Thanks for listening to Hide and Seek. So, I grew up in a 9,000 square foot mansion on half an acre in the elite enclave of Holmby Hills, California, behind a gate and surrounded by walls. And for some of my childhood, we even lived with an armed security guard. There were no sidewalks on our street, which was only 2 lanes, but served as a busy canyon thoroughfare between Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley. There were many famous people who lived in our canyon. I mean, like George Harrison of the Beatles and Marilyn Monroe kind of famous. So I didn't feel like I was some special, different, rich kid. What I felt was isolated. Because when I saw how other people lived on television, there were always kids around. Kids playing tag or catch or hide and seek or hanging out at each other's houses. There were no other kids around my neighborhood. I had older parents who worked and traveled all the time. But when they were home, all their friends' kids were already teenagers or even older. Those kids had friends their own ages. So if I wasn't in school, I was with grown-ups. And they were cool and fun and interesting grown-ups, but they weren't kids. When I was 9, we moved. My mom was redoing our new house, but we had to be out of our old house before it was finished. So we temporarily moved into a smaller house in a neighborhood that looked like the places I saw on TV. The ice cream truck came, kids rode bikes and played on the street and hung out at each other's houses. And for 9 months or so, until we moved again, I felt like a regular American kid, and I loved it. Since then, I've lived in lots of rural or urban places, but I've never lived someplace that felt like where we lived during those 9 months. Until now. This January, I moved to a small neighborhood in a small town filled with mostly older homes. Within a day, I started meeting people, lots of people. One neighbor brought me homemade sugar cookies. Another couple invited me to play pickleball with them. Someone else suggested we go hiking. My neighbor on one side offered to watch my dog. My neighbor on the other side recommended a vet. And another couple invited me to come pick some of their peonies. The people in this neighborhood are like the nicest people I have ever met. When I'm out walking my dog, which is twice a day, I often end up chatting with someone for 15 minutes, and it's so lovely. The other day, I was on the phone with a friend while walking, and she heard one of these neighborly exchanges and said, "Did you, move to Mayberry?" I guess I did. But the funny thing is that much as I love living in this sweet neighborhood with my sweet neighbors, it has brought up some discomfort. My mother was, as I've mentioned, a hider. More than once, when someone had the misguided idea that it would be, a nice thing to just drop by and say hi to her, my mother would open the door and say, "That's lovely of you. Call me and we'll set up a time to get together." And then she would close the door, politely but firmly, right in their face. Other times when we drove by people's houses, people who left their drapes or blinds wide open so that you could see everything going on inside, Mom would exclaim, "Why on earth would anyone want other people to see into their business?" Here, in this neighborhood, people sit on their porches like their living rooms and wave at passersby. My mother would have been horrified, except she would have loved the porches. But I, in some way, am my mother's daughter, because I've had to make an adjustment from being anonymous, invisible in my own little bubble when I go out. Now, I know that if I'm out front or on a walk, there's a good chance I'll see people I know. And that means I have to put my out in the world persona on, meaning I wear clothes that match, I brush my teeth, I try to make my hair look marginally less Medusa-like. And if I don't want to see anyone, I purposely walk in another neighborhood. So what's the big deal with seeing people? Well, that's the question that prompted this podcast. From the time I was little, I was taught that people would always be looking at me. I was the child of a famous person, and people would want to know about me. Furthermore, my mother made sure I understood that I was a representative of my father, of our family, and so it was important that I always give a good impression. Well, that was daunting. I mean, what kid wants to constantly be thinking about what other people will think of them? However, that was ameliorated at least somewhat by how I saw my father move through the world. He loved people. I mean, he really loved people. People lit him up. His favorite lyric came from the music Funny Girl. People who need people are the luckiest people in the world. He sometimes quoted that back to my mother as if to remind her that it was okay that they moved through the world in very different ways. And so I grew up to be a combo plate of the two of them, a hider and a seeker. So what's wrong with that? On some level, nothing. But on another, everything. Because all that focus on what people think has kept me stuck in ego, in me, in my continual POV, which, if I've learned anything at all from my years of spiritual practice, I know to be the absolute kiss of death, the root cause of everything that sends all of us out of spiritual whack. Me, me, me. So, to get underneath that, I decided to unpack the whole idea of neighborliness. Because although we've all heard about nosy neighbors, the true concept of neighborliness, as espoused by everyone from Jesus to Mr. Rogers, basically boils down to those simplest of human virtues, kindness and courtesy. In other words, thinking of others instead of only oneself. Last year, during the pandemic, I shared a driveway with a neighbor, and I don't know what I would have done without her. If Val hadn't been my neighbor in this place that I landed completely randomly by accident, my whole experience of 2020 would have been completely different. Every single day that I lived there, I was grateful for Val, and I still am. It helped that she and I are so much alike, both hiders and seekers, but she is definitely so much more giving than me. Last week, she texted to tell me about some hardy, beautiful rose bushes on super sale. I went right out and bought 2 and texted her thanks, saying in jest, "Now the only thing I need is a shovel." I had planned to ask one of my new neighbors to borrow one. Well, 15 minutes later, Val had driven a mile here and a mile back after a day of work with her shovel. But she didn't knock. She left it outside for me because she'd had a long day of work and knew I probably had too. Honestly, it was the sweetest thing in the world, and it made me ask myself, do I ever go the extra mile or 2 like that? And if not, how do I start? Well, to begin with, I need to get rid of those old stories. A friend of mine who grew up in the military once said, "Nobody's listening and nobody cares." Meaning, if we're all wandering around worried about what other people are going to think of us, then other people are probably doing the same thing that we are. Meaning, no one's paying attention to you. They're all just stuck in their own head. It was a great reminder to her, and now is to me, stop worrying and be present. My mother's old anxiety about appearance, the focus being on me, 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 well, it's keeping the focus on me, me, me. In other words, I'm seeing myself as separate from this wonderful community, not just the one in which I live, but the one in which we all live, this beautiful planet where we really are all one. And that needs to change. Why? Why does my own little POV issue matter? Well, let's just take a look at the news this week. The place that has been long viewed as the crucible of the next world war, the flashpoint for global conflict, a tiny strip of land in the Middle East called the Gaza Strip, is pitting neighbor against neighbor, each one clinging to their me, me, me POV. Global change does begin with us. Now, will letting go of my old stories and my own fears and insecurities, my ego, change the course of history in the Gaza Strip? Well, obviously not. But if every single one of us stopped putting what we need front and center and found a way to be neighborly in any way we possibly can, then actually the whole world would change. Right, I hear you thinking, how's that going to work? Well, I don't know. But unless I start thinking less about me and more about others, Really, nothing is going to change. So I'm going to take my inspiration from the person who inspired the title of this podcast, Hello Neighbor, Mr. Rogers. He said, all of us, at some time or another, need help. Whether we're giving or receiving help, each one of us has something valuable to bring to this world. That's one of the things that connects us as neighbors in our own way. Each one of us is a giver and a receiver. If each of us stop making me the center of our individual little universes, then automatically we begin to see ourselves more as part of a cycle, a flow, a river, a movement of giving and receiving back and forth constantly. And if we each can see ourselves as having something of value, a smile, a helping hand, a shovel to bring to our communities, then we are givers and receivers. I needed a shovel to plant rose bushes in a garden I don't even own because I want to leave where I live more beautiful than when I got here. And the nursery that sold the rose bushes needs to sell rose bushes to employ its workers. And the people who grew the rose bushes need to stay open by selling rose bushes so they can employ their workers and growers. And not to mention the bees and the hummingbirds need to see the beautiful flowers drawing them to this garden so they can pollinate the world. It really is all one big circle. And each of us, not as me, but as we, have something of value to give and receive. And give and receive and give and receive. And when we're doing that, then even our hiding and seeking becomes more balanced and holistic and connective. So let's try to model what we want to see and what we want to be in the world this week by being hello by hello, smile by smile, better neighbors. Hello, neighbor. Thanks for listening to Hide and Seek. Have a great week.